When I was in scouting, I learned how to tie knots, I learned about first aid, I learned about survival, and I learned about camping. What I didn't realize at the time is I was learning about values. And the values you learn and live by determine the impact you have on your world. I may be a sports guy, but I study and I love to talk about people who make an impact on the world. And in our research, we found out that we make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. I'm going to say that again. We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. I call this concept silent impact, and that's what I want to talk to you about here this morning. I covered a track coach at the University of Minnesota by the name of Roy Griak. Now, Roy coached the Gophers for over 30 years. He had a very successful career, and even after he retired, he stayed very involved in the program. Roy coached Big Ten champs, he coached national champs, he coached Olympians, he won Big Ten titles as a team. Well, as Roy was getting ready to pass in his 90s, I started reading tributes to Roy in his CaringBridge and his Facebook page. And all of a sudden, something struck me. Not one of the tributes said, "I would have never made it to the Olympics without you. Thank you for making me a champion. Remember that big meet we won in Iowa?" Not one of them. They all said things like, "Thank you for making me a better parent. I'm a better man today because you were my coach. I just closed the biggest business deal of my life using Roy Griak 101. And it got me to thinking. Roy Griak lived a life of significance, not because of the trophies he won or the champions he coached. He lived a life of significance because of the impact that he had on the world. That's what Roy Griak did. Too many times in our life we get caught up in the destination that we don't enjoy the journey, and we don't realize we all need to be more aware and more intentional with the impact that we have. Now let me start you off with a question. If there were a going away party tonight at your office, or maybe a group or organization you belong to, who would the most people show up for? Think about that for a second, because that person is having a tremendous impact on your group or your organization. We did research on companies and groups, small, medium, and as large as Target Corporation itself, looking for this individual and tried to figure out what traits they had that made them this person of impact. And we didn't always find this person in the usual places. It wasn't always the person who sat in the corner office. Sometimes the person who had the biggest impact was the person who cleaned the corner office. But in each and every case, this person had three traits in common: purpose, persistence, and passion. Purpose, they aligned their actions with their values. Persistence, they were persistent in their positivity, and they were persistent in their preparation. And last but not least, they were passionate. They were the heart and soul of the operation because they cared. You put them all together and you get what I call an impact player. Now, when I talk about an impact player on my highly rated sports shows on Channel 5, it's not supposed to be a joke. My ratings are so bad. My ratings are so bad, I'm in the witness protection program. But when I talk about an impact player, what does an impact player do? They make everybody on the field to play better when they're out there. I know an impact player who I think everybody in this room knows. He was an impact player on the field and an impact player off the field. Joe Mauer of the Minnesota Twins. I'm not sure if Joe was a scout, but he certainly lived by the scout motto and certainly by the values of scouts. 19 years ago, Joe was a senior at Cretin-Durham Hall High School. Now, in every high school, there's a lunchroom. And in every lunchroom, there's a cool table. Wherever Joe Mauer sat 19 years ago was the cool table, because Joe was simply the best high school athlete the state of Minnesota's ever produced. Long before Joe became a 6-time All-Star, a 3-time batting champ, and a 1-time American League Most Valuable Player, Joe was a great athlete. He was recruited by every major college football program to be their starting quarterback. He was an all-state guard in basketball, led his team to the state basketball tournament. But baseball was Joe's best sport. And with the very first pick in the amateur baseball draft, the Minnesota Twins took Joe Mauer out of Cretin-Durham Hall. Joe was the big man on campus. He was tall, good-looking, and soon to be very rich. I'd take any of those three for 10 minutes. Every day, after Joe's fourth hour class, Joe would walk a special needs student who happened to be blind and invite him to sit down at his table during lunch, the coolest table on campus, every day. And I asked Joe, I said, Joe, why did you do this? And Joe's answer was very simple, but yet it was very profound. He said, because it was the right thing to do. I think you could say it was Joe's purpose. He aligned his actions with his values, and because of that, it had a great impact. It had an impact on Mike Hawley. I found Mike Hawley and I asked Mike. Mike's the young man he walked every day. And I said, Mike, what did it mean to you to have Joe Maurer, the big man on campus, to invite you to sit down at his table? And Mike said it was great. He was a senior, and he never had a friend who was an athlete before. And now every day he sat with all the athletes, and they talked sports every day at lunch. So then I started thinking, silent impact. We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. So I put my reporter's cap on, and I found 6 guys who sat around that table every day with Joe Maurer and Mike Hawley 19 years ago. And then the stories started to come in. They said that Joe would walk Mike to his next class once lunch was over. By the end of the first quarter, the guys at this table would fight over who had the privilege to walk Mike to his next class. Wednesdays was pizza day at Cretin-Durham Hall, and Mike would invariably spill some crumbs on his clothing, some pizza sauce in his chin or his cheek. Joe Maurer would nonchalantly grab a napkin, wipe him off, brush him off, and get him ready for his next class. By the end of the first quarter, they were all doing this. These are high school kids. Sometimes they could be the most selfish creatures on God's green earth. But Joe was having an impact, and the impact he had was real, it was powerful, it was profound, it was contagious, and it lasted a long, long time. There was a teacher who monitored that lunchroom who was so inspired that he wrote a poem. And the poem was called Lunch with Mike, but it was really a tribute to Joe Maurer. And in the poem it said, Joe, for the rest of your career, people will judge you by what you do with a bat and a ball. They don't know you. I know you because what I saw you do every day at Cretin-Durham Hall. You never know when you're going to be that person who makes an impact on somebody else. You never know when the person sitting next to you is going through something heavy and they just need some encouragement or some support that day. Purpose, when you align your actions with your values, you can make an impact. People who make an impact are also persistent. They're persistent in their positivity, and they're persistent in their preparation. I remember the time I had to be the most persistent in my life, and I'm going to admit it in this room full of Scout fans and people who support Scouting because I know you're honest. It's when I started to date. You see, I had a problem when I started dating. Every time I brought a girl home, my mom didn't seem to like her. So finally I got smart. I went out and I found a girl that kind of looked like my mom. She dressed like my mom. I know that sounds kind of funky. She wore the same perfume as my mom. I brought her home and it was great. My mom loved her. Now I had a new problem. My dad didn't like her. To be persistent in your positivity, think about people you want to be around in your life. You want to be around positive people. They give you energy. I'd like to live by the 90-10 rule. Everybody talks about trying to have a life in balance. Live by the 90-10 rule. I think if we all look at our lives, we can all agree that somewhere around 90% of our lives are good, if not great. And 10% need a little work. Where people fall out of whack, where people lose balance is when they spend 90% of their time on the 10%. Spend 90% of your time on the good stuff. It'll help you stay persistent in your positivity. Also, try to get rid of as many negative things as you can in your life. That's what people who make an impact do. Listen to the words you speak. Get rid of the negative words you speak. How do you get rid of negative thoughts? We all have negative thoughts. How do you distract yourself to get rid of negative thoughts? And last but not least, have the courage to get rid of negative friends and acquaintances. Several years ago, my wife and I were out to dinner with some friends we hadn't seen in a while. We had a lot of mutual friends, and about halfway through the dinner, we realized this was a really negative night. They were talking trash about some of our mutual friends. They were complaining about the food. They were complaining about the service. They were bragging about their kids, and everybody knows my kids are better than their kids. Now, it was just a completely negative night. And on the ride home, Laura said, that wasn't very fun. I said, no, it wasn't. I said, let's not go out with them. I said, we only have so many nights we can choose who we socialize with. We will not choose negative. Now let's be honest in this room, full of honest scouts. How many of you in the last year, out of some sense of social obligation, spent some time with someone maybe you really didn't want? You can raise your hand just a little bit to kind of admit it. Yeah. If they're sitting next to you, don't look at them right now. Be persistent in your positivity, and you can make a difference. You also need to be persistent in your preparation. I've had the great pleasure in my life to interview one-on-one some of the greatest athletes in our time. Muhammad Ali, Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, Brett Favre, Lindsey Whalen, the U.S. women's soccer team, on and on and on. I tried to figure out what traits do they have that all takes their game to the next level. What makes them the elite of the elite? Well, they all have amazing God-given ability. They're all rich. But what sets them apart is not only the passion to be the best, but the passion to prepare to be the best. They don't want to compete against somebody they know they can beat. They want to compete against somebody they know will push them, that will push their game to the next level. That helps them become an impact player. Be persistent in your positivity and be persistent in your preparation. Last but not least is passion. Passion. They are the heart and soul of the operation. That's what you have to do. I did this presentation. I've been lucky enough to study and work with people over the years and work with different companies and leadership groups and associations. And I was working with a group of Wendy's franchisees owners at a big conference. And afterwards, a lady came up to me and she said, I'm understanding your entire thought process about silent impact. Can I tell you a story? And I said, sure. She said, every day an elderly gentleman would drive through the Wendy's drive-through window for breakfast. And every day he was waited on by the same woman. It was a lady who dropped her kids off at school early, tried to earn the family a few extra dollars working the drive-through window. And the GM said, I wish I had 100 of her. She was the best employee I ever had. Well, one day the old man parked the car and he walked into the restaurant. And he asked the GM if he could see the woman who had been waiting on him the last several months every day for breakfast. So she said, sure. So all from behind the counter comes the lady, and the old man stands in front of her and he says, may I give you a hug? And she says, sure. And he gives her a big old burly bear hug, and he holds on a little tighter than maybe he's comfortable. But when he let her go, he said, I just needed to come here today to thank you. I'm not going to be seeing you as much anymore. Every morning when I came in here for breakfast, I was on my way to the hospital to see my wife, and she went to the good Lord last night. But every day when I came in here, you reminded me of her before she got sick. Nobody ever left a conversation with my wife without feeling better about themselves. Silent impact. We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. So how can we all be more aware and intentional with the impact we have so we can have impact as part of our DNA? When I work with teams, sometimes I bring out, I use a metaphor. If you could build your own monument to the 4 most impactful, influential people in your life, if you could build your own Mount Rushmore of influence, who would you put on your Mount Rushmore and why would they be there? And then emulate what they do. I was doing this presentation to the Minnesota Correctional Association, and we were working with prison guards and wardens and so forth, and I actually had them fill out their Mount Rushmore so we could discuss it. And in the back of the room, a young man raises his hand, and he said, can I tell you about somebody who's on my Mount Rushmore? And I said, yes. He said, his name was Mark Magnuson, prison guard. He said, it's my brother Tim, and Tim didn't go on my Mount Rushmore until he passed away. He said, I could have put any of my brothers or sisters on my Mount Rushmore. We grew up in northern Minnesota. We played a lot of sports. We had a lot of fun. But Tim didn't go on until he passed away, because that's when I realized the impact he made on the world. And that's when I realized that it's the little things that really turn out to be the big things. He said Tim had gotten a job in Columbus, Ohio. And when Columbus was awarded the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team in the National Hockey League, Tim wanted to get a part-time job with the team because he loved hockey and he just wanted to be involved. He ended up getting a job as the elevator operator on game day for the Columbus Blue Jackets. He ran the elevator for the team's families, management, the management families. But Tim wasn't just the kind of guy who pushed buttons. He learned how to push people's buttons in a good way. He had nicknames for all the players. He got to know all the kids. He had treats for the kids. He found out when it was people's birthdays. He became part of the team. Well, unfortunately, Tim was diagnosed with ALS, and he worked with the team as long as he was physically able to. When Tim passed away, Mark went from Minnesota to Columbus to his funeral. And he said about a half hour before the funeral started, a bus pulled up. It was the Columbus Blue Jackets. They had just gotten off a 7-day road trip. They drove a half hour out of the way just to pay tribute to the elevator operator on game day. That's when I realized the impact he had and how important the connections were. But he said, Joe, you gave me goosebumps when you were telling your stories today. Remember when I said we were all pretty good athletes? He said Tim was an excellent athlete. As a matter of fact, he ran track in college. His coach was Roy Griak of the University of Minnesota. We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive, and the impact we make is real, it's powerful, it's profound, it's contagious, and it can last a long, long time. That's why scouting is so important, because the values they teach determines the impact that you have in this world. Of all the research I've done on people in the books I've written, I've figured out a couple of things about people who make an impact. Number one, it's the intersection of two very human traits. We all want to be liked, and we all want to leave a legacy. So why wouldn't we work harder at making an impact? And last but not least, and this is the message I'll leave you with, because this is the secret to the people who make the biggest impact. They have figured this out, that it's not about them, other people liking you. That's not it at all. It's about them liking themselves. And if you can be the person that helps make that happen, guess what? Someday you'll be up there on their Mount Rushmore of influence yourself. It's called silent impact, but you're being heard loud and clear. Thank you so much for all you do for scouting. Appreciate being here.